Alrighty, so we'll see how quick we can make this, but this should be a quick review for the causes of speciation and extinction quiz. Basically, what we're trying to do is answer the question, where do species come from and where do they go? So the goal by the end of this is that you can explain this process of species coming and going. So first, we're going to talk about how students can identify and use common terms related to genetic variation in general, and then we'll describe the importance of genetic diversity so that we can survive. And then we'll do a little recap at the end. All right, so let's talk about speciation. This is a very important word that we need to understand well. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable offspring. Now let's break that down just a little bit. A species is a group of organisms, so like a group of things living together, that when they have babies, those babies can go on to have babies. That's the simple breakdown of that. For example, a horse and a donkey are technically considered different species. But what's weird is that they can have a baby, right? If you've never seen it before, they can have a mule. If you cross a donkey and a horse, they are a mule. However, to make more mules, you can't have this mule be crossed with this mule and end up with anything, right? They just aren't capable of having babies. So we still consider horses and donkeys to be different species due to this one fact. This is not actually that uncommon where two different species can have a child together, but that child is infertile and cannot have children. Classic example is a liger, right? Cross between a lion and a tiger. We still consider those animals to be different species because the liger is infertile and can't have children. So speciation is this idea that if you take the same species and you split them into two different populations for long enough, they will accumulate mutations and they won't be able to share them, a concept known as gene flow. There will be no gene flow, and eventually they're going to accumulate enough unique mutations that if you were to try to cross them again, nothing would happen. So that's the idea of speciation, the creation of new species. There's a couple different ways that this can happen, and we're going to go over some of them. But again, there's just this general idea that over time, population 1 gets separated from population 2, even if they start out the same species. Eventually, they're going to get into such a situation that they cannot cross. So this ability to interbreed with other species, this idea is known as reproductive isolation. So as soon as one population has achieved reproductive isolation with another one, they're going to become a different species, even if they're not there yet. So let's talk about reproductive isolation. There's a couple different ways that this can be achieved. This one question, if you can answer this, you really fully understand what's going on. Any type of reproductive isolation will eventually lead to speciation. Why? You should be able to use the word mutation in an answer here, right? You should be able to explain how mutations can accumulate over time. And you should be able to mention things like gene flow. Not having gene flow where these mutations are being shared between two populations mean they become different if given enough time. So first type of reproductive isolation that we're going to talk about is geographic isolation. Geographic isolation is the idea that if a species can't reach each other, there's no gene flow. So if they have a mutation, that mutation can't spread to anybody else, and they'll end up with different species. This is called the ring species, the Ensatina ring species. This is a type of salamander. This big gap down the middle of California, if you're not very familiar with California, is a desert. It's dry, and salamanders don't do well in dry. So this is an impassable barrier for them. And so something that happens with this ring species is there can sometimes be some interbreeding right here on the borders of these species, but there absolutely cannot be any crossbreeding by the time we get down to here. There's been such a long period of reproductive isolation that they become new species. And this species right here, Xanthoptica, there's a little population that somehow made it across and is over here now, they always stay a distinct species. They don't interbreed with that, okay? So gene flow only is occurring here at the borders of these different species if that's happening at all, but most of the time it's not happening at all. It's happening and staying within the same species. So next type, and I'm trying to go through this really quickly so as not to waste any of your time. Another type of isolation is known as behavioral isolation. This would be a little bit like two people who think the other person is so weird, they don't want to go anywhere near them because their behavior is not attractive. This is a similar way we can think of for behavioral isolation. We see this with the eastern and the western meadowlark. When you look at the eastern and western meadowlark, they actually look exactly the same, but they act in such a way that they don't attract each other, so they don't have any babies, so they are reproductively isolated. The behavior that we're talking about here, we'll see if I can catch it with my audio or not. This is what the western sounds like. And then this is what the eastern sounds like. Oop, unless I can't get it to play. And I don't know if you caught that, but they sound very different. And so these two birds look at each other, and they might look at each other and be like, hot dang, that's an attractive little bird over there. But then they hear each other sing, and are like, ugh, that's gross, right? And so they don't breed. The third type of reproductive isolation I want to talk about real quick is mechanical. This is basically the key does not fit the lock. So if we look at these two different species of dog, technically we consider all dogs to be the same species because they can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. But we're getting pretty close to the point where mechanically different breeds of dogs are becoming isolated from other breeds of dogs. A Great Dane and a Chihuahua are not going to be able to reproduce safely. They are not going to produce viable offspring because mechanically they cannot mate. Then finally, our fourth type of reproductive isolation is known as temporal isolation. This is basically a phenomenon that we find with animals that only reproduce at certain phases of the year when it's been triggered by the weather or whatever it is that's happening. So if they aren't ready to reproduce at the same time, then they can't reproduce and they'll be temporarily isolated. Classic example would be the wood frog and the leopard frog. The wood frog is peaking somewhere in the middle here, mid-March-ish, right? Maybe near the end of March, whereas we're talking about mid-April for the leopard frog. So they will never be able to mate because they don't cross that same way, barring some minimal overlap here. Okay, so that's our first thing that we really need to establish is that idea of speciation and the four things that can lead to reproductive isolation. There's more complicated terms that we can use to explain that, things like allopatric and sympatric and whatever along those lines. But for now, we're going to kind of keep it on the top end. So let's talk about how changing environments can lead and help engage in this process of speciation. So this bar, the yellow bar, represents the environment, right? Which dot color would survive better in the environment of this yellowness? Hopefully your answer is yellow, right? That the normal gene sequence can hide better in the yellow. And if anybody gets a mutation and they turn a color that is not yellow, they're going to be picked off more easily. If the environment color changed, suddenly this yellow normal quote-unquote gene sequence is no longer an advantage because the environment has changed. This new mutated gene sequence is now an advantage. So this is one of the principles that is driving this. This is the principle of natural selection, that when you fit the environment, you do well. If your mutation helps you survive the environment, you do better. If your mutations or phenotypes don't match the environment, you're going to get picked off and not be as common. So let's shift gears just a little bit. Students will need to be able to describe as well the importance of genetic diversity for a population to survive when these environments are changing. So how does genetic diversity help protect a species? One of the problems with this very popular sci-fi series known as Star Wars, hopefully that I'm not an old man for quoting Star Wars, but they start this huge empire on the backs of a clone army. The clone army is so powerful and strong that nobody can overface them. But there is one big weakness of any clone army. The big weakness of a clone army would be, let's just say that the original person that they cloned was particularly sensitive to malaria. Even the slightest hint of a mosquito-borne disease will wipe them out. Well, if you so happen to clone your original clone from this one person and then land on a swampy, mosquito-infested planet, very quickly you're going to find yourself with a problem. You lack the genetic diversity to stay alive. There's not even one soldier who can resist this disease, this illness, and this problem, because mosquitoes are quite deadly. So this idea of genetic diversity is protective because at least somebody's going to survive to carry on the species. And species without high amounts of genetic diversity are not going to be able to recover very well. So this shows a classic example called a bottleneck event. A bottleneck event is where some horrible thing has happened to a population and the only ones surviving are what are left to help recover the population. They had enough genetic diversity to survive whatever in the heck happened here, and then they recover. There's a problem though with this, right? In this situation, if this was the original genetic diversity that we have going on over here, and we have one of these bottleneck events, and we end up with just red and blue because they're the only ones that survive, and we regrow our population, notice that there's not a lot of genetic diversity anymore. Without that genetic diversity, what if something else bad happens and they no longer have the trait that would let them survive? What if in this large population size where we're at now, in order to survive this shifting environment that's happening, the best trait would be actually a green allele, or a black allele. It just doesn't exist anymore because they've already gone through a bottleneck event. This is one of the big things that we're concerned about right now. Historically, we're losing a large number of species, and as we lose species, our overall genetic diversity or our species diversity has gone way down. This is a term we use. We use the word biodiversity to describe the number of species. We have far fewer species alive today than we used to. So this could be termed a bottleneck event, and it's possible we recover. But the problem is if we can't recover, or even if we do recover, we've reduced our available genetic diversity in each of these species. So one of the big concerns that we have as biologists that maybe differ from just a straight up conservationist is conservationists often believe in the ethics of saving life. Biologists are very concerned about saving human life because we need stability in our environment to stay alive and to thrive. And without the genetic diversity that we're accustomed to, ecosystems are going to start to swing far more wildly. So it's one of the reasons why it's worth the investment to restore the genetic diversity of individual species and to increase the total amount of biodiversity in the world so that our environment can stay stable and nice. So I'm going to go through and let me see if I can find my setup here. Good. I'm going to go through here and let's go ahead and try to group some of these terms I've been talking about into usable definitions. So one of the big key terms that we were talking about is reproductive isolation, which is the idea that this will cause speciation to occur if we can do that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab our speciation word over here. And I know as well with speciation, there's different kinds of reproductive isolation. So I'm going to grab some of these other terms and we're going to check them over here as well, because any of these would be applicable to this situation. So I'm going to toss all four of these over and let's go ahead and grab an arrow and we're going to connect these ideas together. I'm going to connect all these as types. Maybe it's better if we flip that. There's the button. Boom, boom, boom. There we go. And we're just going to connect all of these. If I can go back to my arrows button here. Slowly but painfully. There we go. To reproductive isolation. And I would say that reproductive isolation kind of leads to speciation. So I'm going to go ahead and toss that arrow in there. All right, so reproductive isolation, these are all examples of it, and they all lead to that. I think it would probably be more effective if I change these arrows to reflect that idea. There we go. These are all types of reproductive isolation, which will all lead to reproductive isolation. We didn't speak much about convergent and divergent evolution. We'll get back to that. Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about these concepts over here. So we have things like deforestation and climate change and invasive species. All of these things are things that if there's not enough diversity in a population, enough genetic diversity, can lead to extinction. So I'm going to quickly toss in some arrows here over to extinction because all of these concepts lead to extinction if there is not enough genetic diversity to keep that species alive, which is one of the big things that we have, right? If they can survive, right, these things are all, let's say, enemies to biodiversity. Biodiversity helps protect against extinction. So I wonder if I don't even know if I have an arrow here. Let's see if I can find a little arrow that helps us understand this idea that extinction and biodiversity are enemies. They don't work together. So we'll go ahead and leave that as a red thing to say that extinction and biodiversity protects against that. I'm going to flip that arrow there, right? Biodiversity protects against extinction. All right, so species is kind of this isolated idea that we were talking about that is created through natural selection. I would link this word here to this because that leads to that. And then natural selection also leads here to species. And a cladogram is the last thing that we haven't really talked about, which is just how we track speciation. So speciation over time is tracked by a chart known as a cladogram. Speciation in general, I should also add this arrow here of divergent evolution. If you know what the word divergent means, it means things split, right? So speciation is caused by divergent evolution when traits become more different over time. And this is kind of its thing all on its own. Convergent evolution, where multiple species become more similar over time as shifted by their population or by their surroundings. But we'll talk about that in a little more detail at another time. So there's our presentation. Hopefully that helps out as you take the quiz. Good luck.